Welcome back to Sika Strength, and today it's just Garth. Again, I'm really enjoying these videos this week, I'm not going to lie, lads. Obviously, videos with Dara, of course, are great, and we do a lot of great things, and there's a lot of great input from Dara. But today, we're doing a little Q&A video. When I say we, I mean just me, but you guys are joining me on this little adventure Q&A. Some great questions from the Instagram, a lot of great questions. I won't be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to get to a good few ones that are quite interesting and potentially the most helpful for the most amount of people. Would Sika be interested in hosting an online weightlifting camp, Sika Lift Off? So this is something we've thought about and will certainly be enacted at some stage. What we have really thought about and looked into with some other people is a large Sika strength competition, a weightlifting based competition with some variances and with a very interesting take on the weightlifting situation. However, it is obviously a very large project. We'd want to get some very high level lifters involved. And for that, we'd want a lot of cash for them to win, because that's the only way we'd really get these high level lifters. Now, we've quite an interesting idea for that. So I won't talk about it now in case anyone steals it, which probably wouldn't happen, but you'd never know. And it's probably something that will take a bit of cooperation from other people in the community to become the best event possible. So our idea would be to live stream it and then pay-per-view, pretty cheap pay-per-view, and then have some good sponsors, and then have these big lifters go at it in a style of competition that I think would be very, very interesting and what we'd like to see. And of course, we'd see some big lifting. That won't be this year, almost certainly. We've got two big projects on this year in Sika Strength. The first you know about is Sika Sleep, which is coming in the next couple of weeks. So I'm very excited to release that, and myself and Dara are very excited to get the response on that. Then the other project will be released at a later date. There's a lot of work going into that. So we want to make sure that's all done correctly, and obviously alongside running YouTube and making the best videos we can make, and also coaching our athletes and helping everyone involved with the programs. That's a lot for us. So we won't be doing Sika competition this year, but it could be interesting after Paris, maybe something along the lines later next year. But we'll see how it goes. But it's certainly something we've talked about. If you're able to do very frequent squatting, will you need that in the future to progress your squat further? So this is an interesting question. And it's a reasonable, logical progression on what you might think I would need to do to progress my squat. So do I need to squat more often to get beyond that 290? And the answer is, for the biggest squats, it's realistically not a frequency factor, certainly not for non-weightlifters. Weightlifters need to squat more frequently for the skill development of squatting. This frequent squatting in heavy weights or moderately heavy weights reinforces a particular skill that we want for weightlifting. We're practicing the squat and we're frequently using our knee extensors and our hip flexors and our posterior muscles, and this is very beneficial for high-level weightlifters. This, however, is not the best way to get better at squatting for 1RM. If I wanted to maximize my all-time 1RM back squat despite my weightlifting performance, I would need to squat about 2 times a week, and that would be loads. And if you look at all the top powerlifters, a lot of the lighter weight ones, the heavier ones, kind of beyond the 100 kilo plus mark, you'll see they squat about 2 times a week. Now, you will see some lighter lifters will squat more frequency, some, not a lot, but some. I don't think it's necessary, but it certainly is something they can get away with. If I wanted to squat 300 kilos, I would squat about twice a week meaningfully. I would also need to gain some body weight, which would obviously be detrimental for my jiu-jitsu, but would be only in the short term. It wouldn't affect it in the long run. So to get to 300, I could squat 300 at this body weight. I'm around 98 to 100 kilos, depending on the day of the week and how it's kind of fluctuating, gaining a lot of weight. And that's just not something I think I would care for at this stage where I am now. Maybe in a couple of years I might, and a different time I might have wanted to, but I'm very happy with how training is at the moment. I'm very confident I can do 300 kilos with what I have currently. Right now, it would just be, the main thing I would need to do is just to go after squatting. It's literally decide that I want to squat 300 kilos and put the effort into it. Currently, I still love weightlifting and snatch, clean and jerk, and I don't need to squat 300 kilos. And obviously, squatting 300 kilos while trying to progress my jiu-jitsu would also be very difficult. So that's not something that is very congruent. However, there is a big trip coming up during the summer, and then we're going somewhere with a certain giraffe and a certain guy called CK, myself and Dara, and obviously we're going to want to be pretty strong for that. So if I had to near-mark an event, that would be it, but we'll see how it goes. But no, I would need to increase frequency. It would literally be push that squat, make that my main goal for squatting, or my main goal for training, that I want to squat this, and other things would take detriment, my conditioning, my mobility, most likely, my sleep quality because of the extra weight on my throat from sleep apnea, things like speed, the quality of the lift, stuff like that. And right now I don't want to do that, but it is something I do want to do. So I will shed those kind of auxiliary things for the benefit of that one goal, which is something I think more people could take from and pay more attention to. Is you need to define your goals really well and then go after them as much as possible. How to resume training, if at all, after cruciate ligament surgery, meniscus arthroscopy. So this is actually quite an interesting one. And my best piece of advice here, the first thing you should do is go to the physio in the hospital that you get that surgery done on and follow their advice to a T. I've seen quite a few athletes in the double digits, which is enough to see for one particular kind of surgery for some anecdotal evidence. And if you go talk to those physios and you listen to them and you follow their rehab advice, I promise you it'll go very well. Everyone but one person I know who's gotten the meniscus keyhole surgery, I've seen has come out incredibly well from it. I have some athletes myself who've gone through it and they've done incredibly well, and years later haven't had any issues with that. First of all, the surgery went really well due to the nature of it. Second of all, they listened to that rehab and they took approximately 12 weeks time to really go through what they were supposed to do and rehabbed it like they were supposed to. And they listened to the physios, they went back for their checkups and went incredibly well. Now, when it comes to cruciate ligament rehabilitation, this is a longer process, but again, the same thing remains. Listen to the physios in the hospital. Now, physios get a lot of bad rap, and I'll be up front and center say there's a lot of shit physios and a lot of them aren't very helpful. There's a lot of great physios, just like any profession, of course. However, what I will say is more often than not, those physios involved in those cases have seen hundreds, if not thousands, depending on how long they're in a career, of this very particular type of rehabilitation scenario, and they can help you so well. And I've seen this a lot, and it's something that I would be always encouraging people to do. When you get this kind of surgery, go through the system, because the system can help you once you get into it if you listen to their advice. Now, if it seems stupid, then don't listen to it. But it's almost incredibly well-advised stuff from these physios, because they have loads of anecdotal evidence, they've loads of practical evidence, and they've loads of theoretical evidence. Because a lot of these very specific micro scenarios are well studied. There's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of clinical evidence behind it, there's a lot of case studies, there's a lot of research behind it, investigating a lot of the stuff in relation to that. And you should listen to advice. I promise you, if you listen to it, you've a great chance of coming back really well. Now, the meniscus thing comes back pretty fast. The cruciate ligament thing can take quite a long period of time. The last thing you want, though, is to re-injure the cruciate ligament when you hurt it. So please, I'm begging you, I implore you, just listen to those physios, and that's the best place you can start from there. Kieran Connor's asking, why do snatches and pulls, etc. feel faster, easier with straps? So this is quite a simple answer. You are getting a false benefit to your grip that is not realistic to the hook grip, and essentially it just allows you to pull faster, so it allows you to get away with more technical errors. If you imagine there's a window of error in your bar pat, that once the barbell goes beyond this particular window, this fore and aft kind of ratio, where if you go beyond the front of it or the back of it and you miss, you're going to miss the lift if the barbell goes beyond that. When you're using straps during the snatch or maybe even the clean, you can pull the barbell faster, you can end up with a larger window here, still going faster, and end up with a better made lift. However, when you don't use straps, you essentially lose this kind of safety net and this extra attachment, and it ends up meaning you have to pull a little bit slower, more precise. This window is smaller and this barbell speed is lower, and so you have to make lifts with more effort and more precision. Simple question, but I'm sure a lot of beginners wonder about it. Is it worth getting into clean and jerk as a side quest while training powerlifting? I'd love to do 140. This is an interesting question. First of all, I would say if you want to do it and you're willing to accept the negative aspects to your other goals, then I think you should do it, because ultimately, unless you are financially dependent on powerlifting, and even then, if you're financially dependent on powerlifting and your whole family relies on you being better at powerlifting and it's your main goal, and you know if you don't achieve this, then you might not be the most satisfied and it's part of your purpose and it's the top of your triangle, it's on your Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the very tippy top. Self-actualization is to be the best powerlifter you can be. Then I would say if you can accept all that and 140 is involved in that tippy top of your triangle, then I would say go for it. Will it negatively affect your training? Absolutely. Will you get there if you're a very strong powerlifter? Very possibly. You could get there reasonably quickly. Now, getting beyond that could be very, very difficult. But will it negatively affect your training? Only in the fact that it's taking away training time, training energy. It's not going to negatively affect your powerlifting goals in relation to there's some kind of negative interference here. It's not like you're trying to run a 5K as fast as possible in 16 minutes and squat 250 kilos. It's not that. That's not what you're trying to do. They aren't negatively interfering with each other in that their adaptive process provides negative interference. Really what's happening here is just the time you'd need to allot to clean and jerk 140 could be a lot for you in relation to your powerlifting goals. However, if you feel like you've time and you can afford that extra time to clean and jerk, you could feasibly do 2 sessions a week. If you're just clean and jerking, you have some athletic talent, you have decent mobility, and you have someone to help you, could feasibly clean and jerk 140. I didn't check your profile and I don't know how strong you are, but it's certainly possible. It might minorly benefit your lifts once you're able to do that, but it will certainly negatively affect your lifts during the training process for that. However, I would encourage you to chase goals that you really want to do, and that's more important than sometimes letting yourself get stuck in a rut for a particular goal when something else might be as enjoyable, but you've gotten yourself stuck here. So I would say if you can do that 140, if it's something you really want to do, I would say go for it. Powerlifting, there's a long life process involved in powerlifting and strength gains. So unless you're on a very vicious and aggressive cycle at the moment, I would say it's certainly feasible. Just accept that it's not going to be great for your powerlifting, but it's a small amount that will negatively affect it, depending how good you are. Would you coach the lifts differently to a crossfitter than a weightlifter? So pretty simple answer is no, absolutely not. We do the same things. We try and do the same technique. We practice our weightlifting in our weightlifting shoes. We practice them with as much frequency we'll allow. With CrossFit training, we take time down with our weightlifting and our strength training when things are coming up around for the open, for example, during the open. And then when it gets back to normal routine training, programming looks the same. You just take into account those variables. There's no different work most of the time. You just practice the snatch, clean and jerk, technical aspects, improve technical aspects that you need to. The technical model remains the exact same. You improve your strength, you improve your positions, you improve your overhead if you need it, you work on your mobility if you need it. So there's nothing different in terms of how it's taught. Programming is based on the other programming and training load and how much time. For example, if they're a CrossFitter who trains 10 times a week, we'll get 3 weightlifting sessions in. But if they are a CrossFitter who doesn't train 10 times a week, who's not on PEDs, who's training 4 times a week, we might get 2 small weightlifting sessions in. It just depends on the training load, but the technical model remains the same. Training principles remain the same. And then ultimately you just kind of have to take what you get, depending on the value of the athlete, how much value they're placing on it, how much better they need to get. Sometimes you can absolutely do the kind of focus on the complexes, which are very valuable, but it isn't always necessary. A lot of the time, the rest of their kind of WODs and stuff will take care of that. Oh, here's a good one. It's a very meaty answer, but it'll give you something to think on. What are causes of lack of progress? So lack of progress is quite interesting because when you're trying to figure out a sport or you're trying to figure out a skill, there's a certain mindset and there's a certain process that goes into learning every skill. Now, I know this quote is kind of overused and you may have heard it before, but Miyamoto Musashi, the most famous Japanese duelist who purportedly killed something in the region of like 50 men in single combat, killed his final opponent with supposedly a sword he carved from a boat oar. He talked about know the way broadly and you'll see it in all things. In the Book of Five Rings, very short book, you could read it in like 2 hours. It's essentially him talking on skill process, and it's something that kind of makes sense to me now in that regard, is that learning skills requires the same mindset for most skills in the macro sense, and the process with learning mostly involves a lot of failure. And essentially putting yourself through a lot of failure and doing a lot of the wrong things and giving things time and learning from people who know what they're doing. That's essentially that kind of mindset. And you apply that general principle to all skills and you'll start to figure out the specifics. And so when it comes to lack of progress, you kind of need to look at what are the variables involved in that progress that you need to be doing, and what are you not accommodating for, and are you living up to all of those things? So are you injured? Are you training enough? Are you training consistently enough? Are you training with the correct programming? Is your technique okay? Is all of these together? Is your nutrition okay? Have you just maybe got to a point where you need to train more, or the other variables in your life don't allow it? The problem with these things is you don't know what you don't know. And so this is where it comes back to that principles I'm talking about, learning from people who know what they're doing. It's very hard to figure out yourself when you are not making progress to figure this out by yourself. It's so much better, it's so much faster, it's so much easier. And this is one of the reasons for this YouTube channel, is to help people figure it out and give them the best advice. You don't always need to be told exactly what to do, but given someone giving you advice on how to progress, someone who knows what they're doing, the proverbial black belt of your scenario, of your skill, of what you're trying to progress in, can help you so much more than you trying to figure it out. And I appreciate that you're asking this here, and it'd be interesting to see if you had a specific scenario. But in general, it's a couple of different variables, and you need to figure out which one of these is. And you need to figure out which one of these it is. However, it's much easier to get someone who help you. That's why I have a coach for weightlifting. It's why I have a jiu-jitsu coach, and a lot of people help me with that. It's so much better. It's so much more efficient. You'll learn so much more to use for the information yourself, and then you will be able to apply that knowledge so much better, and you can help or be helped in those scenarios. Lack of progress a lot of times just comes from a lack of knowledge. There's a great saying, I don't know who to attribute this to, but it essentially goes along the lines of, if you're lost, the next step is education. If you're educated, the next step is executing. If you're executing, the next step is consistency. And if you're consistent, the next step is patience. That's how you progress. Just Don't Crash is an interesting one here. Any thoughts on idea of flow as relates to sports psych and performance? So this is quite an interesting question. There's an interesting book on this. It's called Stealing Fire. You can listen to it as an audiobook. The reader's a little bit boring on the audiobook, but it is something quite interesting. Flow state, I think, is something that certainly exists. There seems to be some research. Look, when we say the term research, we're encompassing a lot of different things here, and there might be some papers on it, but there's certainly something going on in relation to flow state, and there might be a better place to talk a little bit deeper on this. What I find interesting about flow state is how hard it can be to recreate, and so how hard it can be for you to actually get into a flow state. The book, for example, talks about flow state in Navy SEALs when people working together. They talk about not necessarily having the best of the best of the best. It's the best of the best who can work together, and how these are all 4, 5, 6 people in a unit are moving in synchronous movement, almost like they're one body. Or when we see a group of birds or swallows moving together and see them moving in action, it's almost incredible how that happens. And that kind of flow state comes into some kind of social interactions, and it comes into how you perceive time when you're doing a particular action. Flow state is something that takes a lot of different variables to get into. It takes the right mindset, the right biochemistry, which is influenced by your sleep, your nutrition, how your emotional state is, how much you want to do this thing, how well rested you are. Maybe now well rested you're not. If you use psychedelics, there's so many different things that seem to influence the flow state that it is almost like trying to catch smoke. I don't have a lot to say in it because I don't have any particular advice, I don't think, other than the fact that it is something that may not ever be really well pinned down, or not for the very foreseeable future. Interesting question here. Thoughts on sinking versus soft touch bench in powerlifting? I am very much in favor of the sinking in powerlifting when it comes to benching. I think this is the best way for a vast majority of people to get the most out of their bench. I think the soft touch, so you're essentially touching the top of your chest, is something you'll see a lot of weightlifters do, and their benches just never look great. I know you'll see them benching like 180 or 190. You'll see a lot of elite weightlifters, maybe the Russians, for example, or Lash, or someone benching large weights. But essentially what they're doing is benching the entire lift with minimal body drive. They're benching with their arms as much as is feasibly possible to bench 180 with your arms. I think what this kind of sinking allows us to do is, what we seem to get from it is a much better drive. So you get a deeper range of motion, and this seems to propel you into a better scenario to press off from. What a lot of times we see is when people bring it down, just touch off their chest, and they change direction again immediately, what we're seeing there is it looks like there's a very minimal drive. But when you get someone to kind of sink it in, so we're not letting it resting, so we're certainly very active, and we're maintaining this nice tight position at the bottom, but I think you've got a better stretch at the bottom, and then we're allowing ourselves to essentially use as much of our body as possible, and that seems to be the benefit we get from that sinking on the bench. So I'm a big fan of that, and you see a lot of great powerlifters do that to a degree. Now, we're not bringing that all the way in, we're not crushing ourselves, and it looks more or less depending on kind of the body fat percentage of the lifter, but I think sinking is something that is very, very beneficial for the bench, and it's something I encourage my lifters to do. Again, just want to reiterate, it's not dropping the barbell onto your chest. They're still very active in that bottom position. They're as tight as possible when they're pressing off, but it allows them to press off with their entire body when we bring that barbell closer, and it seems to produce for a much greater bench press. So why are the high hang variations overrated? So the high hang variation overrated, I think mostly because they're misused, and so that kind of comes into the overrated scenario. Every lift has its place potentially for a particular problem. Generally the high hang, so when we're talking from like hip snatches or hip cleans, usually what most people do is they'll use a huge amount of whip and they'll reproduce a contact point or extension point, we should say, that is not really reproducible in the full lift. Now, sometimes this has a place in lifting, but in this particular scenario, I don't think it benefits us. What a lot of lifters do is they will smash the barbell forward, they'll hop after the barbell. In the clean high hang, for example, they'll just row it into their hip, keep it there in a bent arm position, which is what we don't want. And it might be something that they don't normally do in their full lift, and they'll end up just essentially smashing the barbell away and pulling under. A lot of times you'll see the extension is something where instead of getting this nice vertical extension and this use of our traps and this vertical pull and this vertical drive and that full hip extension, for example, in the snatch, we'll see people just lean back away and pull under. We'll see very sloppy foot movement. In the clean, we'll see this overextension of the hips, which is something we don't really want in the clean. We'll see that arm bend in the clean, bring it into the hips, and then you'll see this smashing the barbell away. We'll see this missed timing of the clean as well, so people's ability to time themselves on their clean is not hugely benefited with the hip clean. It's a bit different to the hang variations, but essentially it really comes down to the implementation of the hip clean or the hip snatch. So those very high hang is what I'm kind of talking about. And generally it's how people do them is the main killer. If used correctly, are they useful exercise? Yeah, sometimes just a hang variation is more beneficial. You want longer travel time, more muscular loading in the posterior chain or the anterior chain, what kind of hang variation you're doing. And they kind of essentially, the hip lifts generally turn into a kind of ego lift for most people. You'll see it, for example, in crossfitting is a good example of when that does kind of happen. Now, I know you're going to probably point out one of your favorite lifters does hip cleans, and I know, I get it. They are valuable in certain cases, so I didn't say they're never useful, but most of the time, they're just not what people need. Most of the time, people's problems come from the first and second pull when they've set up the lifts incorrectly. It comes from their setup. It comes from the incorrect knee passage or transition from first to second pull. It comes from a very short second pull and bringing the hips in too soon, over-exaggerating the hips in the clean, for example. So there's so many reasons why the hip clean just doesn't address any of these issues. And maybe if your favorite coach does them or whatever, you know, cool. But I would say a lot of time, I think they're just very low on the usefulness scale for most people, and it's not something I'd put all your eggs into one basket with.